In each separate thing that you do, consider the matters which come first and those which follow after, and only then approach the thing itself. Otherwise, at the start, you will come to it enthusiastically, because you have never reflected upon any of the subsequent steps. But later on, when some difficulties appear, you will give up disgracefully. Do you wish to win an Olympic victory? So do I, by the gods, for it is a fine thing. But consider the matters which come before that, and those which follow after, and only when you have done that, put your hand to the task. You have to submit to discipline, follow a strict diet, give up sweet cakes, train under compulsion, at a fixed hour in heat or in cold. You must not drink cold water nor wine just whenever you feel like it. You must have turned yourself over to your trainer precisely as you would to a physician. Then when the contest comes on, you have to dig in beside your opponent and sometimes dislocate your wrist, sprain your ankle, swallow quantities of sand, take a scourging, and along with all that, get beaten. After you have considered all these points, go on into the games if you still wish to do so. Otherwise, you will be turning back like children. Sometimes they play wrestlers, again gladiators, again they blow trumpets, and then act a play. So you too are now an athlete, now a gladiator, then a rhetorician, then a philosopher. Yet with your whole soul nothing, but like an ape you imitate whatever you see, and one thing after another strikes your fancy. For you have never gone out after anything with circumspection, nor after you had examined it all over, but you acted haphazard and half-heartedly. In the same way, when some people have seen a philosopher and heard someone speaking like Euphrates, although indeed who can speak like him, they wish to be philosophers themselves. Man, consider first the nature of the business, and then learn your own natural ability, if you are able to bear it. Do you wish to be a contender in the pentathlon or a wrestler? Look to your arms, your thighs, see what your loins are like. For one man has a natural talent for one thing, another for another. Do you suppose you can eat in the same fashion, drink in the same fashion, give way to impulse and to irritation, just as you do now? You must keep vigils, work hard, abandon your own people, be despised by a paltry slave, be laughed to scorn by those who meet you. In everything, get the worst of it, in honor, in office, in court, in every paltry affair. Look these drawbacks over carefully if you are willing at the price of these things to secure tranquility, freedom, and calm. Otherwise, do not approach philosophy. Don't act like a child, now a philosopher, later on a tax gatherer, and then a rhetorician, then a procurator of the Caesar. These things do not go together. You must be one person, either good or bad. You must labor to improve either your own governing principle or externals. You must work hard either on the inner man or on things outside. That is, play either the role of a philosopher or else that of a layman. Chapter 29 has to do with choosing what we today call a lifestyle in the broad sense, and really sticking with it, following it through all the way. And Stoicism can be a lifestyle, or it can become a major component of one's lifestyle. And in doing so, there's certain things that it's going to end up ruling out if you take it seriously, if you're not just being a kind of dilettante about it, which is precisely what Epictetus is calling our attention to, the dangers of dilettantism in this chapter. So he says, and this is the general advice, in each separate thing that you do, consider the matters which come first and those which follow after, and only then approach the thing itself. So think about what the prerequisites are, what you need to do if you want to be doing that thing, right? If you want to be engaging in that kind of lifestyle, if you want it to become part of who you are and you to become part of what it is. Then also think about what has to come after that, what the entailments are, or the implications, the things that come along with it. And this includes not only what that activity requires, but also what it rules out, what it's going to make impossible for you. So if you do this, then you'll be able to commit wholeheartedly to something. You'll be able to go all in, as we say. So he says, otherwise at the start, what's the danger? You'll come to it enthusiastically because you've never reflected on any of the subsequent steps. But later on, when some difficulties appear, you will give up disgracefully. And how many times do we see people doing this? It can be with exercise programs. It can be with the latest diet. It can be with learning a language. It can be with mending relationships with family members or friends. It can be about writing the novel, and we can go on and on and on and on, right? Sometimes, unfortunately, it even happens in education, so that people enter into college not quite understanding why they're going to college, and about halfway through, or sometimes even the first semester through, they end up dropping out, often bringing along with them a trail of loans and other losses along the way. And we can say this about relationships too. You're going to jump into a romantic relationship. Think very carefully about, what's going on and what you would like to happen and what is likely to happen. Those aren't always the same thing. What you'd like to happen, what is likely to happen, they don't map onto each other quite perfectly. Now, Epictetus uses an example from athletic training. He says, do you wish to win an Olympic victory? Oh, now, who of us wouldn't want to win an Olympic victory, right? In something or another. Now we've got Olympics that have so many different sports. Perhaps there's even something for one of us. And he says, so do I, by the gods, for it is a fine thing. But consider the matters which come before that, and those which follow after. And only when you've done that, put your hand to the task. If you want to talk all this, stuff about, I could be an Olympic athlete, well, consider what that would actually involve on your part. What would it take for you to be an Olympic athlete? He says, well, you have to submit to discipline. Okay, right there, that's going to rule some people out. You have to submit to training, right? Ascesis. Follow a strict diet. Okay, that too, especially for those of us who love to eat, may be a problem. What else? Give up sweet cakes. Okay, that's kind of a silly example. Train under compulsion at a fixed hour in heat or cold. So it's not just that you go to the gym once a day when you feel like going to the gym. You're going to have a trainer, and that trainer is going to say, get here at 5 in the morning, and we're going to do sprints. And you don't want to do sprints? Tough. You're doing them. Right? Any of you who've been in middle school or high school athletics probably had coaches who pushed you like that, and so you know what that's like. You must not drink cold water nor wine whenever you feel like it. You must have turned yourself over to your trainer precisely as you would to a physician. Physicians in ancient Greek times were kind of pretty hands-on. You didn't just go see the doctor and then, get on the scale, and the doctor says, well, you need to lose some weight and maybe, cut back on the red meat and the fats and quit smoking and quit drinking and all this sort of stuff. And then you don't see the doctor for another 6 months. No, your physician would be somebody who would be there saying, hey, you're not supposed to eat that. Hey, you need to exercise right now. Hey, no smoking. All of these sorts of things. Well, they weren't smoking in Greek times, but you get the idea. So then that's just the start. Now, what is it like when you actually participate? He says, when the contest comes on, you have to dig in beside your opponent, sometimes dislocate your wrist, sprain your ankle, swallow quantities of sand. This would be if you're a wrestler, right? Sometimes take a scourging, and along with all that, after all of that, lose, get beaten. The verb here is nikathenai, meaning the other guy wins the victory. You don't win the victory, right? After all of that work. And we can say the same thing. Oh, you're going to become a big business person? Right. Go do your BA. Now go do your MBA. And don't do it just anywhere. Go to Harvard, or go to, this place or that place or that place, right? I'm not really keen on figuring out which business school is supposed to be better than the others. They probably don't matter all that much. But you have to do all this sort of stuff. Now do your internships. Now do this. Now do that. And you can get out there and still not find the job that you want waiting for you. All these things are possible. This is how we should think about matters in life. So he says, If you've considered all these points, go into the games if you still wish to do so. Think it through. It's not saying don't be an Olympic athlete, just think it through. Are you really up to it? Not just up to it physically, but mentally. Are you up to all the things that would be involved? If you are, more power to you. Go ahead and do it. Now, if you don't do things that way, what's the problem? He tells us. Otherwise, you'll be turning back like children. What do children do? And this is fine for children at the age that children are doing this, by the way. He's not knocking children and saying, oh, stop doing that. You should all be adults. It's just that adults should be adults. And so he says, what do children do? Sometimes they play wrestlers. Again, gladiators. Again, they blow trumpets, then act a play. So you too, now here's the problem, you too, the adult, are now an athlete, now a gladiator, then a rhetorician, then a philosopher. Yet, with your whole soul, nothing. You're not committing to anything entirely. You want to learn a foreign language? Fine, learn a foreign language. Spend an hour a day doing drills and studying things. Maybe you buy yourself, one of these packages that they sell online and have all these great ads about how they're not going to make you do drills. See if that works for you. If it doesn't work for you, do it the old-fashioned way. Put in the time every day. Now start reading some text. You want to learn some Latin? You got to read some Latin texts. Start with somebody easy. Aim for Augustine or Cicero down the line, right? Or some other great author. And just keep plowing at it. But don't pretend just because you're carrying around a wheel-lock Teach Yourself Latin book that you're actually learning Latin because you go in the cafe and putter around for an hour on a Saturday and then go back to doing whatever it was that you were doing. I mean, if you think about this, what is it that most people are particularly good at in our culture? There's their jobs, right? And then there's, say, watching Netflix or enjoying themselves. People can negotiate all sorts of things online. They can find that movie, that obscure movie, by using the Google search engine to, zero in on it. But now, what about doing actual research? What was the progression of the Stoic philosophers, and which ones do you need to read? You can use Google for that too, But it all depends on where you commit yourself. What are you going to commit yourself to? What is valuable to you? So he says, if you do this, you're like an ape. You're imitating whatever you see, and one thing after another strikes your fancy. You're being driven by things coming from the outside, not setting your own purposes. And he says, for you've never gone out after anything with circumspection, nor after you examined it all over, but you act at haphazard and half-heartedly. And it's perfectly understandable that you would do that a person would do that if you've never sat down and planned things out. That takes some doing. And if you come from a family where people don't do that sort of thing, or that's just part of the culture that you grew up in, that's unfortunate. But you have a choice at this point in time. Are you going to continue down that path, or are you now going to change it and think things through and decide, do I want to, when I'm 40 years old, live this kind of lifestyle or live this kind of lifestyle? Do I want to, when it comes to studying philosophy, do I really want to study philosophy and understand it? Or do I want to just have a kind of a smattering of it and bring it up every so often as sort of catchphrases? These are possibilities. One is easy to do. The other one requires something like training for the athletic contest. So he says, in the same way, when people have heard a philosopher and heard somebody speaking like Euphrates, we don't know much about him, but it would be cool if we did, they wish to be philosophers themselves. And that's a fine thing. We see other people doing things. We watch Dances with the Stars, and we're like, oh, man, I wish I could dance like that. We watch some martial arts movie, and then we start thinking, oh, man, I should get back into martial arts. we see some spy movie, and we're like, oh, I wish I knew all these languages, and I could rappel from, these heights and do all, spinning kicks and stuff like that. So he says, consider the nature of the business. Then learn your own natural ability if you are able to bear it. Do you want to be a contender in the pentathlon or a wrestler? Look to your arms, your thighs. See what your loins look like. For one man has a natural talent for one thing, another for another. We're not all meant for the same thing. Now, of course, when it comes to Stoic philosophy, not everybody necessarily has the talent to become an expositor, a teacher of Stoic philosophy, but we all have the capacity to practice it and to learn it if we so choose. That's one of the great things about this kind of philosophy. It's very democratic in that respect. So he says, do you think you can keep on living the same way if you want to become a wrestler? No. You have to do other things. What about for Stoicism? Do you suppose you can eat in the same fashion, drink in the same fashion? No. The answer is you can't. Not if you want to be a Stoic, and that's just the start of it. Give way to impulse and to irritation as you do now. You can't keep on doing that. You're going to keep doing that, but you have to keep yourself as best you can from doing it. And then afterwards, look at yourself and say, oh, I lost my temper. Instead of saying, yeah, it's that guy's fault over there. And what's more, I ought to go kick him or something like that. You say to yourself, oh, I lost my temper. This is not according to my plan of life. I actually set myself behind just as much as an athlete who, because the weekend came, went out, got drunk, and, ate like crap and didn't do any exercise. That's the equivalent for Stoic philosophy. He says, you must keep vigils, work hard, abandon your own people, be despised by a paltry slave, be laughed to scorn by those who meet you, in everything get the worst of it, in honor, in office, in court, in every paltry affairs. Now, this is admittedly not what every single Stoic encounters, but these are the things that can happen. Studying Stoic philosophy is not going to make you a big name in whatever circuit you're in. It's also not going to be something that other people look to and say, oh, wow, that is so admirable, except they'll do that sometimes in a superficial way until they know something about Stoic philosophy. They're not going to look at you the way they do at the celebrities or at the people who have a lot of money or at the people who have, beautiful bodies or the people who have lots and lots of connections. Stoic philosophy is something that you do for yourself. So he says, look these drawbacks over carefully if you are willing at the price of these things to secure, what is the goal? Tranquility, freedom, and calm. Apatheia, eleutheria, ataraxia. These are sort of the trifecta of what Stoics are after. So if that's really your goal, if that's the far off, distant goalpost, then you have to train to reach it. He says, otherwise, don't approach philosophy. Don't act like a child. Now a philosopher, later on a tax gatherer, then a rhetorician, then a procurator of Caesar. These things don't go together. You must be, and here's where it gets really interesting, you must be one person. You're stuck with that. You've only got one you to work with. So is it going to be a good you, or is it going to be a bad you? Or is it going to be a you that's just sort of scattered all over the place, a different form of bad, actually, from the Stoic perspective, but a more unfortunate type in certain ways, right? A bad person who's deliberately bad, you know where they stand. The bad person who's just scattered all over all sorts of stuff and frittering their life and their time away doesn't realize that that's going on. You want to be a good person? You have to be one person. And then you have to train yourself towards goodness. So he says, you must labor to improve either your own governing principle or externals. You're going to work on your finances, or you're going to work on your governing principle. Are you going to work on your circle of friends and making all sorts of connections and networking, or are you going to work on your principles? Are you going to work on, making your body as attractive as possible? Or are you going to work on your governing principle? We could go on and on and on with examples of that. Another great example. You're going to work on your political career, or are you going to work on your governing principle? These are not compatible with each other. You only have so much time and so much attention that you can devote. So where are you going to spend it? And if you're going to try to, spread it over everything, you're not going to get anything in the process. So he says, either work on the inner person or on things outside. That is, play either the role of the philosopher or that of the lay person, the idiotes in Greek. You have to make a decision. So the good news is you actually get to make that decision. Nobody else gets to make it for you. Our duties are in general measured by our social relationships. He is a father. One is called upon to take care of him, to give way to him in all things, to submit when he reviles or strikes you. But he is a bad father. Did nature then bring you into a relationship with a good father? No, but simply with a father. My brother does me wrong. Very well then, maintain the relation that you have towards him, and do not consider what he is doing, but what you will have to do if your moral purpose is to be in harmony with nature. For no one will harm you without your consent. You will have been harmed only when you think you are harmed. In this way, therefore, you will discover what duty to expect of your neighbor, your citizen, your commanding officer, if you acquire the habit of looking at your social relations with them. Chapter 30 is a passage that I think proves difficult for a lot of people to accept in our culture for several different reasons. One of these has to do with the fact that he's connecting morality and what is right for us to do with our roles and our relationships. He says straight out, our duties, our kathekonta, that's a Stoic term for duty, are in general measured by our social relationships. He's not saying that all of our duties are, developing out of social relationships, but that a great many of them are. He says, hos epiphan, in the generality. And this has to do with our skesesi, our relationships, our connections with other people. A lot of these have to do with determinate roles that we inhabit, many of which we don't choose. He talks about, for example, fathers and children. We don't choose to be a child of somebody unless we're going through some really strange, reparenting ritual or something like that. For the most part, that's not really the way it works. We get the parents that we've got, and we're stuck with them. Parents, you can say, well, parents chose to make children. Sometimes that's actually true, but they don't really choose the children that they get. And, we can say the same thing with siblings. We can say the same thing with so many relationships that we're thrown into. And so there's kind of an arbitrariness to it that I think a lot of people have trouble with. There's also some worries about the fact that isn't all this culturally relative? That's an issue that, is a big issue. Can be worked out separately. The short answer is no. Most cultures have some sense of parentage and children and how they should behave with each other. That's not to say that everything is totally constant, but there's a lot of similarities that you can look at across the board. The other thing that I think people really have a hard time with is they look at this and they think that Epictetus is saying that whatever the other person does to you in the relationship, you have to accept it. You can't lay down any boundaries. You can't lay down any limits. And so it seems like there's a possibility for abuse. So it's worth keeping in mind that the Stoic is not going to allow themselves to suffer something that truly is abusive, not only because it would be damaging to oneself. It would place oneself under, a burden that would make it very difficult to practice the Stoic lifestyle. But it's also not good for the other person. The other person who's being an abuser, that's not good for them. That's fundamentally bad for them. And so sometimes by removing yourself from the situation and laying down limits and saying, I'd love to be your kid, but you're really too much with this stuff that you're doing, and you're going to have to knock that off before we can have a healthy relationship. That would be allowable within this. But there is, before you reach that point, a lot of putting up with the other person's nonsense, in part because if you're a Stoic, realize they're not a Stoic, right? And maybe you can talk to them and say, hey, wouldn't you like to live a life where you're not feeling upset all the time and then taking it out on me in this way? But you can't make them do that. That's not something in your control. What is in your control is whether you fulfill your duties and how you do it and how you understand the role that you're in. So he says, our duties are in general measured by our social relationships. This person's a father. So what are you called to do? To take care of him, to give way to him in all things, to submit when he reviles or strikes you. And again, I think that for quite a few of us, we would say some of these parts are culturally limited or relative, but some of them aren't. Respecting one's parents may not necessarily mean that you agree with everything that they say in our culture, which prizes a lot of, back and forth talking and stuff like that. But in other cultures, it might mean that. Or bringing things up at the right time. Not embarrassing your parents by, say, correcting them in public. There's a lot of ways of doing this. Now, notice what he says after that. And this is the complaint. But he's a bad father. And Epictetus says, well, did nature bring you into relationship with a good father? No, simply a father. The roles that we're in, we don't get to choose how the other person behaves in that role. That's up to that person. That's not up to us. In a way, it takes a lot of pressure off to say, I don't need to worry about making that other person do something that they're not going to do, and myself being vexed or upset by it. Children, it works the same way too. People are always trying to get their kids to behave. Some kids just won't behave. Or they'll behave in this circumstance, but not in that circumstance. It's pretty common. If you invest most of your energy in making sure that your children stay all within the lines, that's really a quixotic enterprise, and you're going to be very disappointed somewhere down the line. So he says, maintain the relationship that you have towards this father. Don't worry, don't consider what he is doing, but what you will have to do if your moral purpose is to be in harmony with nature. The goal for you is to maintain your proiresis, your faculty of choice, your moral purpose in accordance with nature. You do that by fulfilling your roles towards other people, not worrying about whether there's reciprocity. Not worrying about whether they did something first and whether you're going to get back at them by withdrawing the role. We could say this about so many other things. We could say this about marriages and, how the partners in the marriage treat each other. It's very common for, little subterranean wars to break out where one person, well, you didn't do that, so I'm going to take something away over here. That would be to go against the Stoic philosophy on these sorts of matters. Same thing with friends. Same thing with classmates. Same thing with all sorts of other relationships. So he says, nobody can harm you without your consent. You will have been harmed only when you think you are harmed. Now, to go back to the abuse thing, if somebody really is being abusive, let's say they're constantly insulting you, tearing you down, I don't think Epictetus would say, well, you have to stay in that relationship and just let them do whatever they want to you because Stoicism. No, that's not what Stoicism consists in. It recognizes us as human beings who are very often, even if perhaps, theoretically we shouldn't be affected by what other people do, when it's parents who are doing it, it's very tough to screen that out. So if we know that we're having trouble with that, or we know that because of the way they treated us long ago, that never got talked about or resolved, that, we're having difficulty in seeing them in the light that we should see them, and they're still driving us nuts because they're not changing, not recognizing things, not apologizing, then it may be that we do have to set down a boundary. And we do have to say, okay, I recognize that in theory, nobody can harm me without my consent, but I'm finding myself giving consent to that, and I want to stop doing that. So he goes on and he says, in this way, by thinking about our duties and our relationships, we will discover what duty to expect of our neighbor, our citizen, our commanding officer, if we acquire the habit of looking at our social relations with them, if we look at our skesis in Greek with them, we can think about how we ought to comport ourselves in relation to other people by looking at the nature of that relationship. And that's not to say that there can't be anything personalized about it, that we have to reduce it just to a role. Oh, you're my superior, so I have to behave towards you in this way. We can have a personal relationship, but there is that role there. And keeping our moral purpose in accordance with nature does have something to do with that. It's not as if our social roles are just things that we put on like clothes and then take off. They are the fabric within which we live. So we really want to pay attention to them because they matter for moral life.